Let me ask you something. What happens when the most powerful military machine in the ancient world, commanded by the richest man in Rome, marches into a desert they don't understand to fight an enemy they've never faced? You're about to find out. And I promise you, the answer is more brutal, more shocking, and more consequential than anything you learned in school. This is the story of the Battle of Carrhae. The year is 53 BC. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in the Roman Republic, leads 44,000 legionaries into Parthian territory. He's hungry for military glory to match his contemporaries, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. He believes the Parthians will crumble like every other Eastern kingdom Rome has crushed. He is catastrophically wrong. By the time the sun sets on that blood-soaked desert, more than 34,000 Romans will be dead or enslaved. It will be one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, and the ripple effects will echo for centuries. Before we dive into exactly how this happened, here's what I need from you. If this video teaches you something new, if it shows you a side of history most people never see, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what shocked you most. And subscribe, because we're telling stories the way they actually happened. No fluff, no dumbed-down narratives, just the facts, the decisions, and the consequences. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back 2,070 years and watch Rome walk into a nightmare. Marcus Licinius Crassus was not a general, not really. He was a businessman who'd become obscenely wealthy through real estate speculation, silver mines, and slave trading. Ancient sources estimated his fortune at 200 million sestertii. To put that in perspective, that was enough to pay the entire Roman army for months. He was richer than some kingdoms. But money wasn't enough. Not in Rome, not in the 1st century BC. Rome worshipped military glory above almost everything else, and Crassus's political rivals had it in spades. Julius Caesar was conquering Gaul, adding territory that would make him immortal. Pompey the Great had defeated pirates, crushed Mithridates, reorganized the East, and returned to Rome as a living legend. And Crassus had defeated Spartacus, a slave revolt. Impressive, sure, but it wasn't conquering foreign kings, it wasn't expansion, it wasn't glory. So in 55 BC, Crassus leveraged his wealth and political connections to secure the governorship of Syria. Syria was Rome's gateway to the east, and just beyond Syria lay Parthia. Parthia was not some minor kingdom. It was a resurgent empire that controlled much of what had once been Alexander the Great's eastern conquests: modern-day Iran, Iraq, parts of Central Asia. The Parthians had overthrown their Seleucid overlords nearly 2 centuries earlier and built an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the Indus. They controlled the Silk Road. They had vast wealth from trade, and they had a military tradition that combined the mounted archery of the steppes with the heavy cavalry tactics of ancient Persia. But in Rome, none of that mattered. The Romans saw Parthia through the lens of their own experience. They'd crushed the Seleucids. They'd humiliated every Greek successor state. They'd conquered Macedonia, destroyed Carthage, and were currently digesting Gaul. In their minds, Eastern kingdoms were soft, decadent, ripe for conquest. Crassus believed this completely. He saw easy victories, vast plunder, and a triumph in Rome that would finally put him on equal footing with Caesar and Pompey. The Senate was skeptical. Some Romans warned that Parthia was different, that their cavalry was legendary, that the desert terrain favored defenders. That Rome had no treaties, no allies, no intelligence network in that part of the world. Crassus ignored them all. A tribune named Attius Capito even tried to physically block Crassus from leaving Rome, standing at the city gates and invoking ancient curses against him. The crowd watched nervously. Some believed the curses would doom the expedition. Crassus didn't flinch. He brushed past Attius and marched his legions out of Rome. He departed with 7 legions, approximately 4,000 auxiliary infantry and 4,000 cavalry. In total, around 44,000 men. It was a massive force by any standard. Each legion contained roughly 4,800 infantry, organized into cohorts and centuries. They were equipped with the gladius, the short stabbing sword that had conquered the Mediterranean. They carried the scutum, the large rectangular shield. They wore segmented armor or mail. And they were drilled endlessly in formation fighting, discipline, and unit cohesion. On paper, they were unstoppable. Crassus arrived in Syria in 54 BC and immediately began planning his invasion. His initial raids across the Euphrates were successful. He captured several Mesopotamian cities, including Nicephorium and Carrhae itself. He installed garrisons, looted treasuries, and returned to Syria convinced that Parthia was weak. But these were border cities, lightly defended. The Parthian military hadn't engaged yet. That winter, Crassus left his garrisons in place and returned to Syria to prepare for a full-scale invasion in the spring. He spent the winter of 54-53 BC gathering supplies, drilling his troops, and planning his route. And this is where his second fatal mistake occurred. Crassus had two main route options into Parthia. The northern route followed the Euphrates River through Armenia. It provided water, supplies, and the support of Armenian allies. King Artavasdes II of Armenia even offered to contribute 10,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry if Crassus took this route. The Armenian king knew the Parthians. He knew their tactics. He warned Crassus that Parthian cavalry dominated open terrain and that the Romans needed either mountainous ground or river valleys to neutralize that advantage. The northern route offered both. Crassus rejected it. Instead, he chose the southern route, straight across the Mesopotamian desert. Why? Speed, directness. And because a local Arab chieftain named Abgar II of Osrhoene assured him this route would catch the Parthians off guard. Abgar promised to guide the Romans safely, provide intelligence about Parthian positions, and even claimed the Parthians were weak, disorganized, and already fleeing before Roman might. Crassus believed him completely. This would prove to be his first catastrophic mistake. Abgar was a Parthian agent sent by King Orodes II to lead the Romans into a trap. In the spring of 53 BC, Crassus led his legions across the Euphrates near Zeugma. They marched into a landscape most of them had never seen, flat, featureless desert stretching to the horizon. The heat was oppressive, rising to brutal levels by midday. Water was scarce, with wells few and far between. The sun was relentless, beating down on men wearing metal armor. The ground was hard-packed sand and stone, difficult to march on, but the soldiers were Roman legionaries, the best heavy infantry in the world. They'd marched through worse. They'd conquered in mountains, forests, swamps. They believed in their discipline, their armor, their tactics. They believed in Rome. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. Parthian scouts, invisible in the shimmering heat, tracked their every move. And roughly 100 kilometers away, a Parthian general named Shauna was preparing to meet them. Shauna was young, probably in his early 30s. He came from one of the 7 great Parthian noble families, the House of Shaun. In Parthian tradition, the head of the Shaun family had the hereditary right to crown the king. Shauna was wealthy, ambitious, and one of the most capable commanders in Parthian service. Ancient sources say he traveled with a personal baggage train of 1,000 camels, a harem of 200 concubines, and hundreds of servants. He was flamboyant, vain, and absolutely brilliant on the battlefield. He commanded a force of about 10,000 men. That's it, 10,000 against 44,000. On paper, it shouldn't even be a contest, but Shauna wasn't planning to fight a conventional battle. He was planning to fight a Parthian battle. His force consisted almost entirely of cavalry. About 9,000 were horse archers, light cavalry armed with powerful composite bows. These were not the simple hunting bows Europeans used. Composite bows were made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, glued and bound together. They had incredible range, penetrating power, and durability. A skilled archer could hit a man-sized target at 150 meters. And Parthian horse archers were among the most skilled in the world. They were trained from childhood. By age 5, they were riding. By age 10, they were shooting from horseback. By the time they entered military service, they could fire accurately while galloping at full speed, while turning, even while retreating. And they practiced a tactic that would become legendary throughout the ancient world, the Parthian shot, turning in the saddle to fire arrows backward while retreating at full gallop. It allowed them to attack, evade, and attack again without ever committing to close combat. It was demoralizing, effective, and almost impossible to counter without cavalry of your own. The remaining 1,000 men in Shauna's force were cataphracts, heavily armored shock cavalry. Both rider and horse were covered in scale armor made of bronze or iron. The riders wielded long lances, sometimes 4 meters in length. These were the elite, the aristocracy, the sons of noble families. They were the hammer that would smash any enemy formation that weakened. But the horse archers were the anvil. They were the weapon that would win the battle. Roman legionaries were built to fight other heavy infantry. Their entire tactical doctrine revolved around the testudo formation, short swords, shields, and discipline. Get close, lock shields, stab with the gladius, advance in formation. It worked against Gauls, Germans, Iberians, Greeks. Everyone Rome had faced so far fought fundamentally the same way, infantry blocks clashing in close combat. The Parthians did not. Crassus's army continued its march deeper into Mesopotamia. Days passed under the merciless sun. The heat intensified. Water supplies dwindled faster than expected. Soldiers rationed their water, but it was never enough. Men started collapsing from heat exhaustion. The younger soldiers suffered most, unused to desert conditions. The columns stretched for miles, kicking up clouds of dust that could be seen from kilometers away. Morale started to erode. Veterans grumbled about the lack of water. Officers worried privately but kept their faces stern. And all the while, Abgar rode alongside Crassus, smiling, reassuring him that the Parthians were fleeing, that victory was certain, that just a bit farther and they'd find the enemy in full retreat. It was all lies. The Parthians weren't fleeing, they were waiting. And Shauna was watching the Romans tire themselves out before he struck. Then, on a scorching day in late May 53 BC, on a plain near the town of Carrhae, the Parthians appeared. It started as a distant shimmer on the horizon. At first, Roman scouts thought it was a mirage, but the shimmer grew, it solidified. Thousands of horsemen spread across the plain in a wide crescent. The Parthians had arrived. And they brought with them something the Romans had never heard before, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Parthians had war drums, large kettle drums made of bronze and covered with animal hide. They beat them in rhythm as they advanced. The sound echoed across the empty desert, a deep, thunderous booming that reverberated in Roman chests. It was psychological warfare. The Romans, already exhausted and nervous, felt fear creeping in. This wasn't like fighting Gauls who charged screaming. This was calculated, professional, terrifying. Crassus ordered his army to halt and form up for battle. The location was near the Balic River, a tributary of the Euphrates, but the Romans weren't close enough to the water to use it defensively. They were in open terrain, exactly where they didn't want to be. Crassus had to make a decision about formation. He had options. He could form the traditional triplex Achaies, 3 lines of infantry with cavalry on the flanks, but his cavalry was vastly outnumbered. He had maybe 4,000 horsemen against 10,000 Parthian cavalry. Flank protection would be impossible. His second option was to form a long, continuous line, maximizing frontage to prevent encirclement. But his officers warned that the line would be too thin, easily broken if the cataphracts charged. So Crassus chose the third option. He arranged his legions in a large hollow square. Infantry on all 4 sides, multiple ranks deep, with the baggage train, servants, and non-combatants in the center. It was a defensive formation designed specifically to protect against cavalry encirclement. In theory, it was smart. No matter which direction the enemy attacked from, they'd face a wall of shields and spears. In practice, it was a death trap. The formation was massive. With 40,000 infantry forming a square, each side was hundreds of meters long. Communication between sides was difficult. Visibility was limited. And most critically, the formation was static. It couldn't maneuver, it couldn't advance, It could only stand and endure, and endurance was exactly what the Parthians wanted to test. Crassus placed his son Publius in command of one section of the square. His quaestor, Cassius Longinus, the same man who would later be one of Julius Caesar's assassins, commanded another section. Crassus himself took position in the center, trying to coordinate the defense. His cavalry, what little he had, was divided among the four sides of the square, ready to sally out if an opportunity presented itself. And then Shurna's cavalry began their attack. The cataphracts advanced first, a terrifying sight. 1,000 armored riders on armored horses, lances lowered, moving at a trot directly toward the Roman lines. The ground shook. The Romans locked shields, braced their pila, their throwing spears, and prepared to receive the charge. This was familiar. This they could handle, heavy cavalry crashing into infantry. The legionaries would throw their pila to disrupt the charge, then meet the riders with shields and swords. Standard doctrine, but the cataphracts didn't charge. They stopped just outside pila range, turned, and rode back. It was a feint. The Romans had tensed for impact, adrenaline surging, only to watch the enemy withdraw. It was confusing, anticlimactic. And then the horse archers moved in. They came from all sides, circling the Roman square at a distance of about 100 to 150 meters. Far enough to avoid pila throws, close enough for accurate shooting. And then they started shooting. Thousands of arrows, not in volleys, but in continuous streams. Each archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. With 9,000 horse archers, that's potentially 90,000 to 100,000 arrows per minute. The actual rate was lower, accounting for movement and resupply, but the volume was still overwhelming. The composite bows used by Parthian horse archers had incredible range and power. Ancient sources, including Plutarch, describe arrows punching through Roman shields, through the shields and into the arms holding them, pinning shield to limb. They describe arrows piercing feet, pinning them to the ground. They describe arrows hitting faces, throats, any exposed flesh. The Romans raised their shields, locked them together in testudo formation. The shields overlapped, creating a wall, but the arrows came from above, arcing down, hitting shoulders, heads, legs, and they came from all sides. The Romans couldn't protect every angle. Soldiers started falling. At first, a few dozen. Then hundreds. The wounded screamed. Medics couldn't keep up. There was nowhere to take the injured. The center of the square filled with bleeding men, crying out for water, for help, for relief, and the arrows kept coming. The legionaries stood firm. That's what they were trained to do. Lock shields, endure, wait for the enemy to close so they could fight back. Roman discipline was legendary. They stood firm against Hannibal's elephants. They'd endured Germanic berserkers. They could endure this, but the Parthians never closed. They just kept circling, kept shooting, and Romans kept falling. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, intensifying the heat. Inside their armor, inside the testudo, the Romans were baking. Men fainted from heat exhaustion. Water supplies were critically low, and the wounded needed what little remained. Morale was cracking. Soldiers started shouting for the enemy to come closer, to fight like men. The Parthians ignored them. Crassus realized he needed to break the cycle. If his army just stood there, they'd be shot to pieces. He needed to drive the horse archers away, to force them into close combat where Roman infantry superiority would matter. He ordered his son, Publius Crassus, to take a detachment and scatter the enemy cavalry. Publius was young, probably in his late 20s. He was brave, energetic, and eager to prove himself. He'd served with Caesar in Gaul and had gained some military experience there. He took command of 1,300 Gallic cavalry, elite horsemen Caesar had sent to support Crassus. He also took 500 archers and 8 cohorts of infantry, roughly 4,000 legionaries. In total, about 5,500 men. He formed them up and charged. The Parthian horse archers in front of Publius's charge did exactly what they were trained to do. They scattered. They turned their horses and fled at full gallop, firing the Parthian shot as they retreated. Publius's cavalry thundered after them, convinced they were routing the enemy. The Roman infantry ran behind, struggling to keep up. Publius's men chased the Parthians for kilometers, leaving the main Roman square far behind. The gap widened, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3, and then, miles away from support, on broken ground near a dry riverbed, the Parthians stopped running. The horse archers split left and right, revealing what had been hidden behind them. The cataphracts, 1,000 heavily armored lancers, formed in a wedge, waiting, and the moment Publius's cavalry came into range, the cataphracts charged. It was devastating. The Gallic cavalry, exhausted from the chase, had no time to form up. The cataphracts smashed into them like a hammer, lances splintered, horses screamed, men were thrown from their saddles. The Gallic horsemen fought desperately, but they were scattered, disorganized, outnumbered. And at the same time, the horse archers circled back and surrounded the entire detachment. Publius's infantry cohorts, gasping for breath after running kilometers in full armor, tried to form a defensive line. But they were in the worst possible position, isolated, surrounded, with no support and no escape. The horse archers poured arrows into the Roman infantry from all sides. The legionaries raised their shields, tried to form testudo, but there were too many gaps. Arrows found flesh, men fell, the wounded piled up. The Gallic cavalry, those who survived the cataphract charge, tried to break through the encirclement. Some made it, most didn't. Publius's officers begged him to retreat, to fight their way back to the main force. But Publius looked at the situation and knew it was hopeless. They were miles away. Thousands of Parthian cavalry stood between them and safety. Retreat meant being run down and slaughtered. So Publius made a decision. He ordered his men to form a tight circle on a small hill. They'd make their last stand there. The Romans fought with desperate courage. They killed Parthians. They held the hill for as long as they could, but the arrows never stopped. Supplies ran out. Water was gone. Men were dying from thirst as much as from wounds. Publius himself was wounded multiple times. An arrow through his hand made it impossible to hold a sword. He couldn't fight, he couldn't lead. He watched his men die around him, knowing he'd led them into a trap. According to Plutarch, Publius ordered his shield-bearer, a man named Censorinus, to kill him rather than let him be captured and paraded through Parthian streets. Censorinus, weeping, did as ordered. He drove his sword through Publius Crassus, son of the richest man in Rome. Then Censorinus killed himself. The remaining Romans, leaderless and surrounded, were slaughtered or captured. Of the 5,500 men who rode out with Publius, almost none made it back. The Parthians cut off Publius's head and mounted it on a spear. Back at the main Roman square, several kilometers away, Crassus didn't know his son was dead yet. He waited for news, hoped for success, and tried to hold his army together. But the situation was deteriorating. The arrows kept coming. The square was packed with wounded. The heat was unbearable. Men were collapsing. Officers shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the screams of the dying. The Roman formation, once a symbol of discipline and strength, was becoming a slaughterhouse. And then, in the late afternoon, the Parthian cavalry returned. They approached the Roman lines slowly, deliberately, and at the front, mounted on a spear held high, was the severed head of Publius Crassus. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Roman soldiers on the side of the square facing the Parthians saw it first. Some recoiled in horror, others screamed. Word spread through the packed formation like wildfire. They killed Publius. The commander's son is dead. They have his head. Panic rippled through the ranks. Men who'd held firm for hours, who'd endured the arrow storm through sheer discipline, felt something break inside them. Crassus himself was brought forward to see. He stared at his son's head, mouth open, eyes lifeless, mounted like a trophy. Ancient sources say Crassus stood motionless, unable to speak, unable to process what he was seeing. Here was a man who'd spent his entire life accumulating wealth and power, who'd built an empire of silver and slaves, who'd marched into Parthia seeking glory to match Caesar and Pompey. And now he was watching his son's severed head paraded in front of his disintegrating army. Some officers tried to pull Crassus away to get him focused on saving what remained of the army. But Crassus was broken. The light had gone out of his eyes. Shauna seized the moment. He ordered his cavalry to press closer. The arrow volleys intensified. The drums beat louder. The Parthians began chanting, mocking the Romans, calling them cowards, daring them to fight. Some Roman soldiers, driven mad by rage and grief, broke formation and charged individually. They were cut down within meters. Others begged to be allowed to charge en masse, to die fighting rather than standing there being shot. But Crassus gave no orders. He just stood there, staring at nothing. It was Cassius, the quaestor, who finally took command. He realized the army would be annihilated if they stayed. He gave the order to retreat. Under cover of approaching darkness, as the sun finally began to set, the survivors abandoned their positions and fled toward Carrhae. They left behind thousands of wounded, men too injured to walk, begging not to be abandoned. The Romans left them anyway. Those men screaming as their comrades disappeared into the dusk were either killed by Parthian cavalry or captured and enslaved. Ancient sources say the screams of the abandoned wounded could be heard for hours, echoing across the desert. The retreat was chaos. Soldiers stumbled through the dark, disoriented, terrified, exhausted. Officers tried to maintain formation, but in the darkness, units got separated. Some cohorts marched together, following centurions who knew the direction to Carrhae. Others scattered into the desert, lost, and were never seen again. The Parthians pursued in the darkness, but cautiously. They didn't know the ground well at night, and they feared Roman ambushes. So they let most of the Romans go, content with the slaughter they'd already inflicted. By the time the remnants of the army reached Carrhae's walls, they'd lost all cohesion, all command structure, and all hope. Of the 44,000 men who'd marched into Parthia, perhaps 20,000 made it to Carrhae that night. The rest were dead or scattered. Carrhae was a small fortified town, not built to hold 20,000 men. The gates opened, and the Romans poured in, a tide of wounded, bleeding, traumatized soldiers. The local garrison was overwhelmed. There weren't enough medics, supplies, or space. Wounded men collapsed in the streets. Officers tried to organize a defense, but Crassus was catatonic. He sat in a corner of the governor's residence, staring at the wall, not speaking, not eating. His son was dead. His army was destroyed. His dreams were ashes. Outside the walls, the Parthians set up camp. Shauna knew the Romans were trapped. Carrhae had limited water and food. The Roman supply lines were cut. All Shauna had to do was wait, and the Romans would either starve or surrender. But Shauna was impatient. He wanted to finish this quickly, so he sent a message to Crassus the next morning. A proposal: let's negotiate. Meet me outside the city, and we'll discuss terms for your safe withdrawal back to Syria. Crassus didn't want to go. He knew it was likely a trap, but his officers, desperate for any way out, pressured him. They argued that Shauna had no reason to kill a Roman commander under a flag of truce, that it would be dishonorable, and the Parthians valued honor. That maybe, just maybe, Shauna would accept a ransom and let them leave. Crassus, exhausted and broken, too tired to argue, agreed. He rode out the next day with a small escort. Roman officers accompanied him: Cassius, some tribunes, cavalry commanders. They approached the Parthian camp under truce banners. Shauna met them on horseback, smiling, courteous. He offered Crassus a horse, suggesting they ride together to a nearby location to talk privately. Crassus mounted the horse. They began to ride, and then, suddenly, one of Shauna's officers grabbed the reins of Crassus's horse. Crassus's Roman escort reacted instantly, drawing swords. A scuffle broke out. Blades flashed. The Parthians outnumbered the Romans. Crassus, old and slow, tried to draw his sword. A Parthian officer named Polyxathus struck him down. Other sources say Crassus was stabbed by multiple attackers in the chaos. Either way, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, died in the dirt outside a minor Mesopotamian town, far from home, his quest for glory ending in blood and betrayal. The Parthians killed most of his escort. Cassius managed to escape, fighting his way back to Carrhae with a handful of survivors. The Parthians cut off Crassus's head and right hand. According to Plutarch, They later poured molten gold into his mouth as a symbol of his greed, though other sources question whether this actually happened or was added later for dramatic effect. Either way, the symbolism was clear. Rome's hunger for conquest, embodied in its richest man, had been punished. With Crassus dead and leadership gone, the remaining Roman forces in Carrhae faced an impossible choice: stay and starve or attempt a breakout. That night, several thousand soldiers tried to escape under cover of darkness. They split into groups, each trying different routes back to Syria. Some made it. Most didn't. The Parthians patrolled the desert, hunting down survivors. Small groups of legionaries, delirious from thirst, staggered through the sand. Many died of dehydration before the Parthians even found them. Others were captured. A few hundred, led by competent centurions who knew how to navigate by stars, managed to reach Roman territory. Cassius, who'd escaped the massacre of Crassus's escort, led one of the larger groups. He was a capable officer, one of the few who kept his head during the disaster. He gathered about 5,000 survivors and led them on a desperate march westward. They moved at night, hid during the day, rationed water, and avoided Parthian patrols. After days of brutal travel, Cassius's group reached Roman Syria. He'd saved 5,000 lives, and his actions at Carrhae would later influence his role in Roman politics. But even Cassius couldn't save most of the army. Of the 44,000 men who marched into Parthia, approximately 10,000 made it back to Syria. 20,000 were dead, and 10,000 were captured. Those prisoners faced a fate worse than death in some ways. They were marched east, deep into Parthian territory, hundreds of kilometers from anything Roman. They were settled as frontier guards near the border of Margiana, in what's now Turkmenistan, on the edge of the Parthian Empire. The Parthians used foreign captives this way often, settling them on the frontier to guard against nomadic invasions from Central Asia. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Some historical sources and later Chinese records hint that when Parthia itself came under pressure from nomadic invasions decades later, these Roman prisoners, or their descendants, were sent even farther east. Some scholars believe they ended up serving as mercenaries in the armies of Central Asian warlords. And a few controversial but fascinating theories suggest some may have ended up in China. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing a century later, mentions rumors of Roman soldiers seen in the Far East. Chinese records from the Han Dynasty describe a battle in 36 BC near the Talas River where Chinese forces encountered mercenaries using a fish-scale formation, which some historians believe could be the Roman testudo. One theory suggests these were descendants of Carrhae prisoners. In the 1990s, some researchers claimed DNA evidence in a village in Gansu Province, China, showed possible Roman ancestry, though these claims remain hotly debated and largely unproven. Whether or not Roman legionaries actually ended up in China is still a mystery. What's certain is that 10,000 Roman prisoners disappeared into the east and never came home. Their families in Italy, Gaul, and the provinces never knew what happened to them. They became ghosts, absorbed into an empire that didn't speak their language, didn't share their gods, and didn't care about their suffering. Back in Rome, the news of Carrhae arrived like a thunderbolt. The city was stunned. Disbelief turned to shock, shock to outrage. One of the most prominent men in Rome, a member of the first triumvirate, was dead. An entire army, 7 legions, destroyed. The standards, the sacred eagles that represented each legion's honor, captured by barbarians. It was a humiliation on a scale Rome hadn't experienced since Hannibal. The Senate held emergency sessions. Accusations flew. Who was to blame? Crassus, obviously, but he was dead. Could anyone have stopped him? Should they have? The tribune Attius, who'd cursed Crassus at the city gates, was vindicated in a grim way. His curses had come true. Some Romans saw Carrhae as divine punishment for greed and hubris. Others saw it as military incompetence. Everyone agreed it was a disaster. Public mourning swept through Rome. Thousands of families learned their sons, brothers, fathers were dead, or worse, missing. Not knowing was agony. Some families held out hope for years that their loved ones would return. They never did. The social impact was enormous. Entire neighborhoods lost their young men. Farms went untended. Businesses collapsed. The human cost of Carrhae extended far beyond the battlefield. Politically, Carrhae had massive consequences. The first triumvirate, the informal alliance between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, collapsed. Crassus had been the balance. He was the financier, the man both Caesar and Pompey needed. With him gone, nothing held the other two together. And Pompey's daughter, who'd been married to Caesar, had died in childbirth the year before. The personal and political bonds were broken. Within months, Pompey and Caesar began moving against each other. Political maneuvering escalated, alliances shifted, violence erupted in the streets of Rome. And within 7 years, Caesar would cross the Rubicon, plunging Rome into civil war. The Republic would tear itself apart. And while Carrhae didn't cause all of that directly, it was a critical domino. Crassus's death destabilized Roman politics at the worst possible moment. On the Parthian side, Carrhae was celebrated as a defining victory. Shauna returned to the Parthian capital at Ctesiphon as a hero. His triumph was legendary. He defeated Rome, the greatest military power in the world, with a force 1/4 its size. He'd captured Roman standards, symbols that would be displayed in Parthian temples for decades. He'd proven that Rome could be beaten, but Shauna's glory was short-lived. King Orodes II of Parthia, the man Shauna served, grew jealous. Shauna had won too great a victory. He'd become too popular, too powerful. Nobles whispered that Shauna could challenge for the throne. Orodes couldn't allow that. Within a year of Carrhae, Shauna was summoned to the royal court and executed on false charges of treason. The man who'd humiliated Rome, who'd achieved one of the greatest military victories in ancient history, was murdered by his own king out of petty jealousy. History has few ironies sharper than that, but the victory itself echoed through Parthian culture. Carrhae legitimized Parthia as a great power. It proved they could stand toe-to-toe with Rome, and it established the composite bow and horse archer as weapons that could challenge the legion. For the next 700 years, Parthia and its successor state, the Sasanian Empire, would be Rome's primary rival in the east. The frontier between Rome and Persia would be contested, violent, and soaked in blood for centuries. Let's step back and analyze what actually happened at Carrhae. How did 10,000 Parthian cavalry destroy 44,000 Roman soldiers? It comes down to terrain, tactics, intelligence, and leadership. Terrain first. The Mesopotamian desert was the worst possible environment for Roman legionaries. No cover, no trees to break up cavalry charges, no rivers or hills to anchor a defensive line. It was open, flat killing ground. The Parthians had grown up in this landscape. They knew how to fight in it. They knew where the water sources were, how the heat affected men and horses, how far visibility extended. Crassus knew none of this. He marched his army into terrain that negated every advantage Roman infantry had. Tactics. The Roman legion was designed to close with the enemy and win through superior discipline and close-quarters combat. Everything about Roman training, equipment, and doctrine assumed you'd eventually get within sword range. The gladius was a stabbing weapon, effective at arm's length. The scutum was designed to lock with other shields, forming an impenetrable wall in close combat. Roman tactics worked when the enemy stood and fought. The Parthians refused to play that game. They used standoff weapons, mobility, and harassment. They turned the battle into an endurance contest, and the Romans had no counter. The testudo formation protected against arrows from one direction, but not from all sides simultaneously, and it was static. Once in testudo, the Romans couldn't maneuver, couldn't advance, couldn't do anything but stand there and take it. Shauna exploited this perfectly. He kept his horse archers out of Roman reach and let physics do the work. The Parthian composite bow was a marvel of ancient engineering. It could shoot arrows with enough force to penetrate Roman shields and armor at range. Modern reconstructions suggest a draw weight of 60 to 80 kilograms, comparable to English longbows. But unlike longbows, composite bows were short enough to use from horseback. That combination of power, range, and mobility was devastating. And then there's the arrow supply. Roman commanders assumed the Parthians would run out of arrows. Standard thinking: archers carry a quiver with 20 to 30 arrows, shoot them all, then they're useless. But Shauna brought a logistical innovation that changed everything. He brought a camel train loaded with thousands of arrows. Every time the horse archers ran low, they rode back, resupplied in minutes, and returned to the fight. The Romans never got the respite they expected. The arrows were endless. Intelligence was another critical factor. Crassus was operating blind. He trusted Abgar, who betrayed him. He had no reliable scouts, no understanding of Parthian capabilities, no maps, no intelligence network. He didn't know how many Parthians he'd face, where they'd attack, or what tactics they'd use. He marched into Mesopotamia blind and deaf. Shauna, meanwhile, knew everything. He knew where the Romans were, how many men they had, their marching speed, their water supply situation. He chose the battlefield. He controlled the timing. He forced the Romans to fight where and when he wanted. Information asymmetry decided the battle before the first arrow flew. Leadership. Crassus was not a battlefield commander. He was a politician and financier who wanted military glory. Every major decision he made was wrong. Ignoring the northern route, trusting Abgar, marching into the desert with insufficient water. Forming a static defensive square against mobile cavalry, sending his son on an unsupported pursuit, meeting Shauna outside Carrhae without adequate security. Every choice compounded the disaster. Shauna, by contrast, was a tactical genius. He understood his enemy's strengths and refused to engage on their terms. He used deception, showing his cataphracts first to make the Romans think he'd fight a conventional battle, then pulling back and unleashing the horse archers. He exploited Roman psychology, displaying Publius's head at the moment when it would cause maximum morale damage. He managed logistics, keeping his cavalry supplied and watered, and he achieved all this with a force 1/4 the size of his opponent. It's one of history's greatest asymmetric victories. Carrhae exposed fundamental flaws in Roman military thinking. The legions were not invincible. Their tactics could be countered. And Roman commanders were not automatically superior to their enemies. This lesson was painful, costly, and largely ignored for decades. Rome would spend the next 2 centuries trying to conquer Parthia. Emperor Trajan invaded in 113 AD, captured Ctesiphon, and declared victory. But his army was harassed constantly by Parthian cavalry, and he died before securing his conquests. The territories were abandoned. Emperor Marcus Aurelius fought Parthia in the 160s AD, won some battles, but couldn't hold territory. Emperor Septimius Severus sacked Ctesiphon in 197 AD, but again couldn't pacify the region. The Parthian frontier remained violent and unstable. Why couldn't Rome conquer Parthia? Partly because of what they learned at Carrhae. The east wasn't like the west. The terrain favored cavalry. The enemy wouldn't stand and fight Roman-style battles. Supply lines were long and vulnerable. And most importantly, Parthia had strategic depth. Even if Rome captured cities, the Parthian cavalry could retreat into the interior, regroup, and counterattack. Rome never figured out how to hold Parthian territory. Carrhae also changed Roman military doctrine, though slowly. After the disaster, Rome placed greater emphasis on auxiliary cavalry. They recruited horsemen from Gaul, Germania, North Africa, anywhere they could find skilled riders. By the time of the empire, Roman armies had significant cavalry wings, but they never developed horse archers to match the Parthians. That required a culture of horsemanship Rome didn't have. The battle had cultural impacts too. Roman writers obsessed over Carrhae. Plutarch wrote a detailed account in his biography of Crassus. Cassius Dio chronicled it in his Roman history. Livy mentioned it, though his account is lost. Each writer tried to make sense of the disaster. Was it divine punishment for greed, military incompetence, bad fortune, betrayal? The loss became embedded in Roman cultural memory, a cautionary tale about hubris and the dangers of underestimating your enemy. Roman rhetoric used Carrhae as an example for centuries. Orators warning against reckless wars invoked Crassus. Moralists warning against greed pointed to his molten gold death. Generals planning eastern campaigns studied Carrhae to avoid repeating its mistakes. The battle became shorthand for catastrophic failure. On the Parthian side, Carrhae was celebrated as proof of their greatness. Parthian art depicted the victory. The captured Roman standards were displayed in temples as trophies. Later Parthian and Sasanian rulers invoked Carrhae when negotiating with Rome, reminding Romans that they could be beaten. The battle legitimized Parthia's status as Rome's equal. Let's return to the human cost one more time. 34,000 Romans did not come home. That's not an abstract number. It's 34,000 individual lives, farmers from Latium, shopkeepers from Gaul, shepherds from Spain, young men who'd been drafted into the legions and sent to die in a desert they'd never heard of. They didn't choose this war. Crassus chose it for them, and they paid with their lives. Many of those men had families, wives who waited for husbands who never returned, children who grew up without fathers, parents who lost sons. The grief rippled through Roman society for years. Some families never recovered economically, losing their primary breadwinner. Others never recovered emotionally, haunted by not knowing how their loved ones died. The 10,000 survivors who made it back to Syria were broken men. They'd watched their comrades die by the thousands. They'd abandoned wounded friends. They'd seen their commander killed. Many suffered from what we'd now recognize as PTSD. Some were discharged, too traumatized for further service. Others were reassigned to garrison duty, away from frontline combat. A few, like Cassius, went on to political careers, but even they carried the scars. And the 10,000 prisoners, sent east into Parthian captivity, disappeared from Roman history. We don't know most of their names. We don't know what they thought, what they endured, whether they ever adapted to their new lives or spent every day longing for home. They became footnotes, absorbed into an empire that didn't speak their language, didn't worship their gods, and didn't care about their suffering. Carrhae should have been preventable if Crassus had listened to the Senate's warnings, if he'd taken the northern route through Armenia, if he'd secured better intelligence instead of trusting Abgar, if he'd been a competent military leader instead of a wealthy man playing at being a general. But he didn't, and 34,000 men paid the price for his ambition. There's a lesson in Carrhae that echoes through military history. Superior numbers don't guarantee victory. Wealth doesn't buy competence. Technology and training don't matter if you can't bring them to bear. And underestimating your enemy, especially in their own territory, is a recipe for catastrophe. The Romans learned that lesson in the desert outside Carrhae. Other empires would learn it again in different deserts, different mountains, different jungles. The details change, the lesson doesn't. Carrhae stands as one of the most complete military disasters in ancient history, not just a defeat, but an annihilation. Not just a loss of men, but a collapse of morale, reputation, and strategic position. It humiliated Rome. It emboldened Rome's enemies. And it changed the course of Roman history in ways Crassus never imagined when he marched east seeking glory. If you're still watching, I want to know your thoughts. Could the Romans have won if they'd fought differently? What would you have done in Crassus's position? And what do you think happened to those 10,000 prisoners who disappeared into the east? Drop your answers in the comments. Let's have the kind of conversation most history classes never allow. And if this story taught you something, if it showed you a side of Rome you didn't know existed, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who care about real history. Not the sanitized version, not the oversimplified hero-worshipping propaganda. The actual story with all its blood, stupidity, brilliance, and tragedy. History is full of moments like Carrhae, battles that changed everything, decisions that destroyed empires, leaders who failed catastrophically, and we're going to keep telling those stories because they matter. Because understanding how things actually happened makes us smarter, makes us better at recognizing patterns, better at avoiding the mistakes of the past. Carrhae was a disaster. It was a massacre, it was a humiliation, but it was also a turning point. Rome learned slowly and painfully that they had limits, that the world was bigger and more dangerous than they thought, and that glory, real glory, wasn't bought with gold or ambition. It was earned through competence, preparation, and respect for your enemy. Now you know what really happened in that desert 2070 years ago, not the legend, not the summary from a textbook, the actual story, the decisions, the suffering, the consequences. That's what we do here. And if you want more of it, you know what to do. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.